The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Lottie Crane's last dollar ran out. She stood at the post office window in Harwick, Montana, the envelope in one hand and her empty coin purse in the other, and she read the words twice before they settled into something real. Her aunt, her father's sister, the woman who had taken her in after the fever, took both her parents in the same November, had died in her sleep on the 14th. The house in Billings had been rented, not owned. There was nothing to inherit but a rocking chair Lottie had never liked and a debt to the dry goods merchant on 5th Street. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. She stood there long enough that Mr. Sim, the postmaster, cleared his throat from behind his cage. "You all right, Miss Crane?" "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Sim." She walked out into the gray October morning and stood on the boardwalk with the wind pulling at her coat. She was 24 years old. She had 11 cents, a carpetbag with 2 dresses and a Bible, and a letter of introduction to a rancher named Burl Haddon, who had posted a notice on the church board 3 weeks ago looking for a cook and housekeeper. She had copied the address onto a slip of paper and carried it in her pocket since then, not quite willing to use it. It had felt like defeat. Now it felt like the only door left standing. The Haddon spread was 9 miles north of Harwick, up a road that turned to mud after the first real rain. The man at the livery told her this, without looking up from the harness he was mending. He also told her Burl Haddon was a widower, that he ran good cattle, that he didn't have much to say for himself, and that the last woman he'd hired to cook had left after a month without giving notice. "Why'd she leave?" Lottie asked. The man shrugged. "Couldn't get used to the quiet," some said. Lottie considered that. She had been living in a house full of her aunt's silence for 2 years. She thought she could manage quiet. She hired a ride with a farmer going north and asked to be let off at the turnoff. The rest she walked, her carpetbag shifting against her leg with every step. The land opened up around her as she went, flat and wide and enormous, the sky pressing down on it like a hand. Mountains rose in the far distance, pale blue and indifferent. The grass was the color of old straw. A hawk circled somewhere overhead, high enough that it was just a shape against the clouds. She found the ranch by following the fence line. A low cluster of buildings appeared, a main house, a barn, 2 smaller outbuildings. Everything was weathered but sound. Someone maintained it. The fence posts were straight. The yard was clear of debris. A stack of firewood stood against the side of the house, so tall it nearly reached the eaves. She stopped at the gate and stood there a moment. Then she unlatched it and walked up to the door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Footsteps. Heavy, unhurried. The door opened, and a man filled the frame. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been lived in hard, not old, perhaps 40 or near it, but weathered the same way the barn was weathered, solid and a little rough and clearly meant to last. He looked at her with a pair of very still, very dark eyes. "I'm Lottie Crane," she said. "I've come about the cook's position. I have a letter of introduction from Reverend Greer in Harwick." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the road, as if checking whether she'd come alone. "Burl Haddon," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "Come in, then." The kitchen was large and cold. The stove had gone out. There were dishes stacked in the dry sink, unwashed, and the floor needed sweeping. And a pot on the back of the stove held something that had dried to a dark crust days ago. She looked at all of this without comment. He handed her the letter back, after reading it, and nodded once. "The wage is $8 a month," he said. "There's a room off the back of the kitchen. It's small." "That's fine," Lottie said. "There are 5 hands. Breakfast at 5:30, dinner at noon, supper at 6. On Sundays dinner is at 1. Yes, sir. He looked at her again with those still eyes. You know how to bake bread? I do. Real bread. Not the hard kind. Something flickered in her, not quite amusement, not quite irritation. I'll bake you a loaf tomorrow morning and you can judge for yourself. He almost did something with his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. Room's through there, he said, and nodded at the door beside the cold stove. Then he took his hat from the hook and went out. She stood in the empty kitchen for a moment. Then she found the broom. The room off the kitchen was small, as promised. A narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall, a single window that looked out at the side of the barn. The mattress was thin but clean. Someone had put a folded quilt at the foot of it. Faded blue and white, stars and pinwheels worn soft with years of washing. She ran her hand over it before she sat down. She did not know why it nearly undid her. It was only a quilt. But it was there, folded and waiting, as if someone had thought ahead to her needing it. As if her coming had been anticipated. She put her carpetbag on the floor and her Bible on the washstand and looked at the ceiling for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. She was all right. She was going to be all right. She got up and went back to the kitchen and started a fire in the stove. She rose before 4 o'clock the next morning and mixed the bread dough by lamplight. She'd started a simple sourdough the night before, with the flour and warm water she'd found in the pantry. Her mother had kept a starter going for as long as Lottie could remember. And she knew by feel when the mixture was right. It needed more time than she had, but she coaxed it along and had 2 round loaves in the oven by 4:30 and biscuits beside them. By 5 o'clock the kitchen was warm. The hands came in stamping mud from their boots. A collection of men who ranged from a boy of perhaps 17 to a gray-bearded man called Fowler, who moved like his knees pained him. They were polite in the way that men are when they are uncertain of a new arrangement. They said ma'am and thank you and didn't talk much. Burl Haddon came in last. He hung his hat on the hook by the door, washed his hands at the basin, and sat at the head of the table. He looked at the food in front of him. The biscuits, the bread already sliced and set out, the side pork, the eggs, the coffee that was hot and strong. He picked up a biscuit. He broke it in half. Lottie was at the stove with her back to the table, but she heard the silence that followed. The particular quality of it, the small pause in conversation, told her something had shifted. She didn't turn around. "Miss Crane," he said. "Yes, Mr. Haddon, this is good bread." It was not a lavish compliment. He said it the way a man reports weather, simply, as fact. She turned from the stove and found him looking at her steadily, the half biscuit still in his hand. The other men had gone back to eating. Only he was still watching her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked back at his plate. It was not until she was washing up afterward, alone in the kitchen with steam rising from the basin, that she realized she was smiling. She learned the shape of the ranch over the following weeks. She learned the rhythms of the men. Who took his coffee black, who wanted 3 eggs instead of 2, who would slip extra biscuits into his coat pocket for the ride out. She learned that the gray-bearded man Fowler had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, and that the boy, whose name was Tuck, was terrified of the 2 roosters that stalked the yard. She learned Burl Haddon's patterns too, though he was harder to read than the others. He came in first when he was troubled, and last when he was satisfied. He never complained about food, but she could tell by the way he ate. Slowly, with attention, when something pleased him. He never praised her work again in so many words. But one afternoon, she came back from the root cellar to find her kitchen window had been refitted, the rattling pane she'd been ignoring, replaced with a tight new one. She hadn't mentioned the rattle to anyone. He did not look up when she came in. He was at the table with his account ledger. "The window," she said. "Letting cold in," he said, without lifting his eyes from the page. She stood there a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Haddon." He turned a page. "Dinner ready soon?" 20 minutes. "All right," he said. She went back to the stove. She was getting used to this. The way he spoke, or didn't speak, in the currency of things done rather than things said. She found, to her own surprise, that she understood it. She had spent 2 years in her aunt's house learning how much a person could communicate without words. A room kept warm, a lamp left burning, a window fixed before she thought to ask. She began to respond in kind. When she noticed one of his good work gloves had split at the seam, she mended it without comment and left it on the peg by the door. When she saw him rubbing the back of his neck after a long day in the cold, she started keeping a pot of strong coffee on the stove through the evening hours. Small things, unremarkable things. But she noticed after a while that he had started lingering a little longer over supper, that he'd sometimes still be at the table when she brought the coffee pot for a second round, where before he'd have taken his cup out to the porch. She told herself she didn't read anything into it. She was fairly good at believing herself when she put her mind to it. The trouble came in the second month. She was rolling out pie crust on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd found a crate of late apples in the root cellar and intended to use them when she heard the sound of a wagon in the yard. Heavy wheels, a good team, the kind of rig a man drove when he wanted to make an impression. Through the kitchen window, she saw a man climb down from the seat, broad and red-faced, in a coat that cost more than she'd made in a year. He looked at the house the way men look at land they're thinking about buying. He went around to the front door. She heard voices in the front room, low at first, then louder. She kept rolling the crust. She did not intend to listen, but the kitchen door was not quite shut, and voices carry in a house that size, and after a while she could not help but hear. The man's name was Orvis Kane. She gathered that he owned the spread to the east and had been trying for some time to acquire Haddon's water rights, or failing that, the grazing allotment that ran along the north fork of the creek. "Be reasonable, Haddon," she heard him say. "The offer I'm putting on the table is more than fair. You're not getting any younger, and running this operation alone." "I'm not alone," Burl Haddon said. A pause. "Your hand's sure, but you've got no family here, no son to leave it to, without someone to carry it forward." "I said I'm not selling." "And the girl in the kitchen?" Kane's voice took on a different quality. "Knowing. That won't last. They never do out here. You'll be alone again by spring. And then what? The offer stands till the end of the month, Haddon. Think on it." She heard the front door open and close. She heard Burl Haddon's steps cross the room. Slow, even, the way he always moved, as if there were no cause in the world to hurry, and then stop at the kitchen doorway. She didn't look up from her pie crust. "He's gone," Haddon said. "I heard." She reached for the rolling pin. "I hope you didn't let him track mud on the floor." There was a silence, then, "I didn't." "Good." She could feel him watching her, that same still attention she'd gotten used to. She kept her eyes on the pastry. "Lottie," he said. She looked up. He almost never used her given name. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "I'm not selling," he said. "I know," she said. "The apples will be ready by 6. Something moved in his face. He nodded once and went back out. She stood at the counter and pressed both hands flat against the cool flowered board and breathed through her nose until the feeling in her chest settled into something manageable. She hadn't let herself think too hard about what Kane had said. The girl in the kitchen. Because if she last started thinking about it, she might have to admit that she'd already started to think of this kitchen as hers. The way she'd rearranged the pantry shelves, The sourdough starter she'd managed to cultivate from scratch, a small crock of it, now sitting in the warmest corner near the stove, wrapped in a bit of cloth to keep it steady. She'd brought nothing from her old life that mattered. The starter was new. She'd made it here, from flour and water and whatever invisible wildness lived in the Montana air. She wasn't going to let Orvis Kane's voice take root in her. She finished the pies. The hard days came in December. One of the hands, a young man called Reese, who'd only been on since October, let a gate latched badly, and a section of the east herd scattered in a night blizzard. It took 3 days to recover most of them, and those 3 days cost Burl Haddon 2 good cattle and a fence line that needed rebuilding from the posts up. He didn't take it out on anyone. He didn't shout or slam doors. He just got quieter, and the quiet had a different texture to it, heavier, drawn tighter across his shoulders. She watched this and said nothing. But one evening, when he came in late and sat at the table, long after the other men had gone to the bunkhouse, she brought him a plate without being asked, and poured his coffee, and put a wedge of the dried apple pie she'd made that afternoon beside it. She didn't sit down. She went back to the sink and started putting things away. She heard the sound of his fork. "Miss Crane," he said after a while. "Mr. Haddon, you don't have to stay up." "I know," she said. She was hanging the pot on its hook. "I'm nearly done." He didn't say anything else. She finished putting the kitchen to rights and banked the fire for the night. When she turned to go, she found him watching her, the same way he'd watched her on that first morning when she'd turned from the stove. Direct, unhurried, as if he had nowhere else in the world to be looking. She said good night and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with her hands in her lap. She understood, somewhere in the quiet center of her, what was happening between them. She understood it the way you understand the weather coming. Not from any one sign, but from the whole of the air. She also understood that he was not a man who would say so easily. Probably not at all until something forced his hand. She wondered, sometimes, what that something would be. It was Fowler who told her. He found her at the well one morning in early January, drawing water, and he stood beside her with his hat in his hands, and the manner of a man delivering news he didn't relish. "You know about the bank?" he said. She didn't. She said so. He told her. The loan Haddon had taken out 2 years ago to rebuild after a drought year, a drought that had killed half the herd and all but stripped the north pasture, had come due. The banker in Harwick, a man called Mr. Dunfield, had agreed to an extension at the time, but Dunfield had sold the note to a man in Billings, and the new holder wanted payment in full by February 1st. The spread would cover the debt, but only just, and only if sold. If Burl Haddon sold, he'd have enough to pay what he owed, and enough left over to start over somewhere smaller, somewhere cheaper. Or he could hold on and lose it all when they came to foreclose. "He's going to try to hold," Fowler said. "That's the kind of man he is, but I don't see how he manages it." Lottie drew her bucket up and stood with it in both hands, looking out at the flat gray field. The mountains were invisible in the low cloud. "Does he know you're telling me this?" she said. Fowler looked uncomfortable. "No, ma'am." She thought about Orvis Kane and his expensive coat. The offer stands till the end of the month. She thought about the quilt folded at the foot of the bed the day she arrived, the window fitted tight against the cold, the starter living in its warm corner by the stove. "Thank you, Fowler," she said. "Go on to breakfast. I'll be in directly." He took his hat in his hands and went. She stood at the well until her arms ached from the bucket's weight, which is how she knew she'd been standing there longer than she'd meant to. She made a rhubarb cake that afternoon, not for any reason except that she'd been saving the dried rhubarb from the root cellar, and it seemed like the right day for it. She mixed it with the last of the stored sugar and a little cinnamon and let it bake slow. And by the time supper was done and the hands had gone, the kitchen smelled of warmth and sweetness and something that had no name she could put to it. Burl Haddon was at the table with his ledger again. He'd been at it for 3 evenings running. He hadn't said a word about Dunfield, or the note, or any of it, and she hadn't asked. She put a piece of cake in front of him. She sat down, which she hadn't done before, not at his table, not while he was in the room. She set her own cup of coffee on the wood and folded her hands around it. He looked up. "I know about the loan," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not quite. More like a man bracing. "Fowler," he said. "He was worried about you," she said. He didn't know what else to do. Haddon looked back down at the ledger. "It's not your concern, Miss Crane." "No," she said. "But I'd like it to be." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire settled in the stove. He looked up again, and this time there was nothing guarded in it. He looked at her the way you look at a thing you've been trying not to look at directly for a long time. "What do you mean by that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Lottie Crane had not planned what she said next. She'd been rolling it over in her mind all afternoon, poking at it from different angles, the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it. But when the moment came, the words arrived without ceremony. "I mean that I'm not leaving in the spring," she said. "I mean that I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. And I mean that 2 people working together can sometimes manage what one person cannot." He stared at her. "That's a practical thing to say," he said slowly. "Yes," she said. "I'm a practical person. You're also 24 years old and—" He stopped, looked at his ledger, looked back at her. "This isn't a good situation, Lottie. The ranch might not. I know what it might not do," she said. "I know about the note. I know what February means." She held his gaze. "I'm still saying I'd like to stay." The silence lasted long enough that she heard the wind move against the window. The new window fitted tight. "Why?" he said. It was such a plain, direct question that it caught her somewhere in the chest. She thought about it honestly. "Because this kitchen is the first place I've lived that's felt like mine," she said. "Because the sourdough I started in October is still alive, and it's the first thing I've managed to keep alive since." She stopped, started again. "And because I think you're a good man, Burl Haddon, and good men deserve someone in their corner." He sat very still. She picked up her coffee and took a sip that she didn't taste. "I'm also an extremely good baker," she said, "which I understand is difficult to replace." Something happened in his face then, slow, like light coming up on a winter morning. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close, the closest she'd seen. "That's true," he said. "So," she said. He put his hand on the table, palm down beside the ledger. She looked at it. Then she put her hand over his. They sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen, with the fire burning and the wind outside, going wherever wind goes in Montana in January. "I'll write to Dunfield's man in Billings," he said finally. "There may be a payment plan." "There may be," she said. "And if there isn't, then we'll figure out what comes next," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. His grip was careful, the way a man holds something he doesn't want to break. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. February came and did not take the ranch. The payment plan came through, barely, and with terms that left them lean through the spring, but it held. By March the worst of the winter had broken, and the north pasture was showing the first green. And 2 of the cows had dropped healthy calves. Reese, who had spent the winter carrying the weight of the scattered herd on his conscience, was the first to laugh when the second calf came out, and immediately tried to stand up and fell straight over sideways. The laugh went around the barn, and Lottie, who had not meant to be there at all, found herself laughing too. Haddon was standing beside her. He was not laughing, but his eyes were warm, and he looked at her sideways with that almost smile she'd learned to read like weather. "Good sign," he said, "about the calf." "Very good sign," she agreed. They stood in the barn with the smell of hay and new life around them, and didn't move apart as quickly as they might have. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in April. He came to the kitchen door after the noon meal, when the hands had all gone out, and the house was quiet, and he stood there with his hat in both hands, and said her name once. Just that. She turned from the window. He was not a man for long speeches, which she already knew. He looked at her steadily and said, "I'd like you to be my wife, Lottie, if that's something you'd want. I know there's a lot I'm not, but I'd take care of you. I'd try to deserve it." She looked at him, standing there in the kitchen doorway, this large, quiet, careful man who fixed windows without being asked, and who had held her hand in the dark of a winter evening, and who had never once made her feel like a ghost passing through his life. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." Something crossed his face. Relief, she thought, and something softer underneath it, that she suspected he would never quite put into words, but that she understood completely. "I'm going to keep my starter," she said. "Just so we're clear." That got the laugh. A real one, low and sudden, and it changed his whole face into something she hadn't seen before, and immediately wanted to see again. "You can keep your starter," he said. They were married in June on the porch of the ranch house, with the mountains visible for once, sharp and clear against a blue sky, and every man standing in the yard in their cleanest shirts. Fowler cried. He denied it afterward. Nobody argued with him. 4 years later, Lottie Haddon sat on that same porch in the long light of an August evening. Her daughter, asleep in the cradle burl, had made from pine boards and sanded smooth as silk, her sourdough starter alive and well on its shelf inside, fed this morning, as every morning, without fail. The starter was 4 years old now, born from Montana air and a cold October, and something Lottie refused to call anything other than stubbornness. Burl came out and sat in the chair beside her. He handed her a mug of coffee the way he always did, the way he'd been doing it since the second month, hot and strong without being asked. She wrapped both hands around it. Somewhere in the near pasture, one of the horses moved through the grass. "You know what I was thinking about today?" she said. "What?" "That loan. February, the way you sat there with that ledger." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were going to say something sensible and leave." She looked at him. "Leave? That's what a sensible person would have done." He turned his head and looked back at her, his dark eyes steady and warm. "Good thing you're stubborn." "Good thing," she agreed. She reached over and rested her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own without looking, an easy, settled gesture, the kind that comes from 4 years of small habits accumulated into something that holds. Inside, on her shelf by the stove, in the warmth that she had made her own, her sourdough starter was rising slow and steady, doing what it had always done, waiting, ready, alive. That is the thing about a life built quietly, without ceremony. You don't always see it being built. You look up one day, and the walls are around you, and the roof is sound, and the fire is going, and you realize that every small act, every fixed window and folded quilt and hand held in the dark, was a board laid down, a nail driven true. A life is made the same way bread is made, with patience, with attention, with a willingness to let things rise in their own time. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply stay.